So section 5.6 is called completing the square. So right now, there's a few uses to completing the square. The whole idea is we are taking an equation in standard form, and instead of keeping it in standard form, we want to write it in vertex form. Okay, the numbers will change. So even though these are, let's just say, these would be the same equations, you're not going to see the 5, the 6, and the 8 once you write it in vertex form. Things change. And so there's a lot of advantages to having a quadratic equation in vertex form. One is we can find the max or min or vertex value really quickly. And so that's probably the best use for it. Number two, when you go to solve a quadratic equation, typically solving in vertex form is quicker and less errors than if you use the quadratic formula. And then three, in the future, you will learn other shapes in math classes like secondary 3 and secondary 2. And having an equation in vertex form will identify other features of that graph. So it's got three purposes really. So in this class, since it's all about solving quadratic equations in this unit, we discuss completing the square. So how do you do it? Well, the first thing is there's 5 steps, and they sound really long, but I promise at the end of my 4 examples, you'll have the idea down. All of these examples are not the same level of difficulty or I guess issues. So the first 2 are very similar. The next one, number 3, will have a different feature, and example 4 is definitely going to be the hardest. So if you're skipping the first 3 examples, make sure you watch example number 4 because there is one major difference. And I don't have a note on the steps because it's just you working through it, and you'll realize it as you get to the problem, what's different about it. Okay, so just a little note at the beginning of this video in case you don't make it to the end, you definitely need to watch example number 4. So on my example, I just have x squared plus 22 plus 10x. So what you'll notice is there's always going to be an x squared term and an x term. All right, and so I call this 10x the x term, not the x squared term. So these steps, I'm going to walk you through how to write them. It's not quick, but like I said, if you write down all the steps that I do, it will make more sense and you'll get the hang of it, and you'll have these 5 steps memorized by the end of this video. So the first thing that we want to do is you always want to put the terms in order. If they're already in order, step 1 is done, but I picked an example that's not. So I'm going to write y equals, I put the x squared first, then I put the 10x, and then the 22. Okay? Like I said, if that one's done, then you go ahead and you just move on to step number 2. All right, so step number 2, you mentally want to group the x terms together in a parenthesis. So what I mean is I really want to think of this and this. But before I just rewrite that, just so you know, we are going to add a blank in the parentheses and add a blank outside the parentheses. What you'll notice is 1 is plus and 1's minus, because really if you add 5, you need to subtract 5 in order to balance that out. So you really added 0 because 5 minus 5 is 0. So step number 2 is going to be in purple. We get y equals, I'm going to make a big parenthesis, x squared plus 10x. See how that just stays the same. But now I want to add a plus with a blank. I'm going to keep the plus 22 outside the parenthesis, and then I need to subtract a blank. So that's how it's going to balance each other out. So step number 2 is adding your parentheses and your blanks. All right, so that's why you kind of need the video. That really, I could write it out, but it'd be a lot longer and still confusing, so the video should help. All right, step number 3, let's change to green. Now we want to do what's called completing the square, and you'll figure out why later. So for right now, we just have to do it. So the way you complete the square is you take the x term. So the x term on my problem is 10x. So I'll write it right here. And we divide it by 2. Sorry, not the x. The 10, we divide it by 2, and we square it. You do all of this in your head or on paper, okay? You don't really see that work in the problem, really. So I'm going to take 10 divided by 2 is 5. 5 squared is 25. So I'm going to write that right here. So I got 25. Now, I'm going to write that on both blanks. So, okay, I wanted to use green because it is the third step, but I don't need to write another line, okay? All right. So the next step, step 4, I'm going to make blue, is we want to simplify the last two numbers, so the numbers that are outside the parentheses. So I get y equals x squared plus 10x plus 25. And then 22 minus 5 is negative 3. Okay? And it's already starting to look like vertex form. The last step is we want to factor the parentheses. Now, I have factor in parentheses because you really actually don't have to factor. So if you never learned factoring or don't like factoring, you still can complete the square. I promise you. So what you're going to do is right here, we're going to write, I'm going to make it black, y equals, I'm going to have a parenthesis with a squared because it tells you that right here, and an x. Now I'm going to save this plus because it might be a minus. I'm going to take that middle term again, which is 10, and we divide it by 2. Okay? So 10 divided by 2 is 5. And that's what goes, since this was a positive 10, this is a positive 5. And that's what goes right here. Okay? Now, I still have the minus 3. This is done. This is in vertex form. So if we really wanted to, I could say, oh, our vertex of the parabola, remember, is the opposite of this number and the same as that number. That's why we really use vertex form, is to quickly identify the vertex. You have to remember all the rules. But what I want to do, since this problem is done, is I want to say, hey, why does step 5 work? So just watch. You don't have to write this down. So let's go back to this blue step. If I did just this inside, if I factor this, I'm going to write it in pink. Well, that would be the AC method. So x squared times 25 is 25x squared. I need the factors of 25 that will add to give me 10. So positive 5 times positive 5, and we split the x up. So remember, we rewrite the middle term, 5x plus 5x, and we keep that 25. Then we do factor by grouping. I look at these two, we can take out an x. I look at these two terms, I can take out a 5. So we divide by 5. And then I put the outsides in a parenthesis, and the repeat goes in a parenthesis. Now, what happens is these are the same factor. They're always going to be the same factor. That's why we call it completing the square. Square means the same. So if I have x plus 5 times x plus 5, I can rewrite that as x plus 5 squared. And that's what we have right here. So all I did to go from the blue step to the black step was I really did factor this without doing all that work. Okay? It will always work out that way. So you don't have to do any factoring, but realize that we can take step 5 shortcut because we are factoring, and that's how it works. All right, these are perfect square factors. Okay, so let's try one on our own. So now easy just means this is the easiest it's going to get. There's not a lot of coefficients. The numbers are even for the x terms, so that makes the whole process a lot nicer. You won't have any fractions, okay? So that's what I mean by easy. So I know my steps are up here, but I'm going to go ahead and just write them together, and I'm going to use my colors too. So step number 1 is to put them in order, which, oops, on these, we need to put the y, sorry. it got left off. They're already in order. So step number 2 is we want to put a parenthesis, x squared plus 8x. We're going to add a blank. We keep the plus 3, and then we subtract a blank. Equals y. All right, I'm going to try to go slower. So now I'm going to change to purple. So step number 3 is to complete the square. So I'm going to label it here. So complete the square. So I'm going to take this middle term, which is 8, positive 8. We divide it by 2, and then we square it. So you can type that into a calculator, but 8 divided by 2 is 4. 4 squared is 16. So 16 is what goes on the blanks. All right. Step number 4 is we're going to combine the last two numbers. So I get x squared plus 8x plus 16. And then 3 minus 16 is negative 13. Now, I typically could combine step 4 and 5. I just chose not to. So step number 5 is we need to write our squared term. So remember, to get this number, we take that middle 8, and it's positive, divide it by 2. So I get x, and then 8 divided by 2 is plus 4. And this is done. All right. Okay, so let's try another nice one. We've got even numbers, so no fractions. So step number 1, we want to put them in order. That's already done. So step number 2, we want our parenthesis. We're going to group our x's together. We're going to add a blank. Then we're going to put our number, and we subtract a blank. It's always adding and then subtracting outside. Okay. Step number 3, we're going to complete the square. Complete the square. You can do this in your head. So we're going to take that negative 14, we divide it by 2, and we square it. So negative 7 squared, make sure you use the parentheses, is 49. So that's what goes on both blanks. Okay, step number 4, we're going to clean up the outside numbers. So x squared minus 14x plus 49. Negative 8 minus 49 is negative 57. So step number 5 is to write it in factored form. So we get x squared minus 57 equals y. And then this number is going to be that negative 14 divided by 2. So negative 14 divided by 2 is negative 7. So this becomes minus 7. Make sure you watch your signs. So then, as a reminder, if we wanted the vertex, remember it's the opposite and the same. Okay? We're not doing the vertex, but we could find the vertex. It's really, if we wanted to do the vertex up here, we'd have to do negative b over 2a, then we plug that back in to find the y value. So vertex form really gives you a lot of information quick. Let's look on a medium problem. So this will be a little harder. So first thing, we want to put them in order, and they're not. So y equals, I've got x squared plus 5x. That's not what makes this a little harder though, plus 9. So step number 2 is I want to group. I want to put the x's together. We're going to add a parenthesis, and we're going to keep the 9 and subtract a parenthesis. Okay, can you tell it makes this harder? So complete the square. So we're going to take positive 5 divided by 2, and we're going to square it. Now, this should tell you, oh, it's an odd number. So we're going to get a decimal or a fraction. I will take either one, okay? So let me clear this out. 5 divided by 2. And if we square that, I got 6.25. Now, I am okay with decimals. So 6.25, 6.25. And that's what made this a little harder. So step number 3, we're going to clean up those outside numbers. So y equals x squared plus 5x plus 6.25. And then 9 minus 6.25 is positive 2.75. Make sure you put your plus or minus. So if we were finding the vertex, you could do that. And our last step is to write it in factored form. So we get x squared plus 2.75. So remember, this number right here, we're going to take that middle number and divide it by 2. So it's positive 5, sorry. So I get plus 2.5. And we completed the square. So now if I wanted to, I could say, oh, our vertex is at negative 2.5, 2.75. It opens up. Minimum value is 2.75. Lots of questions we could answer. All right, the last example is the hardest, okay? It is a little tricky and I don't have any notes on the steps, so you just need to watch this example to see the difference. It adds one extra twist. So step number 1 is we still want to put them in order. So that is done. Step number 2, we want to group. So I get 3x squared minus 24x plus, and then plus 12 minus equals y. Now, this is where the twist comes in. So I'm going to put a big star here. What happens is, you haven't noticed it before, but this number in front has always been a 1, okay? And so when it's not a 1, that makes completing the square the hardest variety. So what we need to do is we need to common factor just that number in front, the coefficient. So I'm going to take out a 3. So I know they have an x in common, but really that third term wouldn't. So I'm going to take out a 3. So that's my extra step for right now. So minus, if I divide by 3, and I still have my parenthesis. Notice I can't move on to step 3 yet. That's important. Okay, so the extra step is right in here. So I'm going to go up here and I'm going to put in a little star. You have to do it before step 3. All right, so now I'm going to do step 3. So step 3 is I'm going to complete the square. So I take negative 8 divided by 2 and we square it. So I get negative 4 squared is 16. Now, this is also tricky. So 16 is going to go on this blank. But remember, I would have factored out a 3, so we need to multiply that back to figure out what goes on my second blank. So 3 times 16 is 48. Okay? That's the trick or twist. So you want to common factor out the coefficient, and then on the second blank, you want to multiply that back. So our blanks don't match, but that's because we had that 3 in front. Now everything else stays the same. So I'm going to, on step 4, I'm going to keep the 3. We're going to keep this. And I'm going to clean these up. So 12 minus 48 is negative 36. Then our last step is to write this in factored form. So x squared minus 36, we get negative 8 divided by 2, which is negative 4. So our vertex would still be at 4, negative 36. It opens up, it has a vertical stretch because A is bigger than 1, and we are done. Okay. All right, I give you some choice. There's complete 4 out of 6 problems, okay? Email me if you need any help or check in on Wednesday's Zoom this week.